everyone, and welcome to a new series dedicated to the creation of my Magpie dress. My name is Laura Kane, or Chibi Rhinoa in the cosplay world, and if you've never seen any of my work before, I am a professor of fashion design and a longtime cosplayer and just a really obsessive sewing person in general. I only just recently began documenting my sewing process, and I did this largely because I really love watching other costubers videos. I really enjoy seeing the process of how somebody goes from their idea to their finished product, and I love seeing all the different techniques that people use to put their work together. Admittedly, I am also looking at this as an alternative to blogging. I do have a website where I was blogging about my creations, but I found that got out of date really quickly and I wasn't updating it as often as I wanted to. Because I'm a teacher, I have an easier time with verbalizing my ideas rather than trying to write about them. Anyway, on to the new project. I'm going to be recreating a gown featured in an illustration from the book Fancy Dresses Described. The 5th edition of this book was released in 1887, and it included 16 full-color illustrations to add on to the already existing costumes and ideas that were already in the book. This book is available in its entirety on archive.org, and I highly recommend you to check it out because it's got a lot of hysterical ideas and some really great illustrations. This book is kind of a glossary for home sewers to look at and come up with new ideas for fancy dress. The Magpie illustration accompanies an already existing Magpie description, but it was then supplemented with a new description to match with the fashion plate. Think of this book as the 1887 version of a Halloween costume catalog where it gives you ideas of different characters, different themes, and then some basic ideas of how to put together a costume from things that are in your wardrobe or things that are relatively easy to acquire during that time period. The editor of the 5th edition describes that there were 16 new illustrations added for this edition, the Magpie costume being one of them.
Half black, half white dress. Hair powdered on one side and not on the other. One glove and one shoe black, one white. Short satin skirt with gauze tunic bordered with fringe. Basque bodice, gauze fichu, satin ribbon tied in a bow at the throat, gauze cap. All half black and half white, so that the wearer seems on one side all black, on the other all white. A magpie on the right shoulder. For an original rendering, see colored plate 10. The front of the skirt is striped black and white satin plated. The bodice cut in one long side reverse of black, lined and turned back with white ruching to the hem of the skirt. Opening gown back to show full plaited skirt. The back bodice bordered with white, low striped vest, magpie on the shoulder and in hair, which may be powdered or not, or half powdered.
Part of what really interests me about this design is it looks very modern for its time period. Again, this illustration was released in 1887, and the illustration features a sleeveless gown with a low neck and just a slight bustle in the back. Now, the lines are very streamlined. When I first saw this illustration, I was immediately reminded of the 2001 Valentino gown that Julia Roberts wore to the Oscars. I will show you a picture here. This gown, I saw it for the first time when I was 14 years old, and that was just at the time when I was really starting to get into sewing, and I adored this gown. I really loved the stripes in the back. I love the fit of it. I love the little sheer piece on the front. I love black and white stripes in general. I actually wore a ton of them growing up. So when I saw this gown for the first time, I was just starstruck. The Magpie dress illustration also has these really great big birds on the top half of the gown. She's got one giant bird on her head and one giant bird on her shoulder. And if you know anything about me, it's a pretty well-known fact that I love Alexander McQueen. He was my favorite designer, and I immediately thought of the 2006 Philip Tracy Alexander McQueen collaboration for his Widows and Cullodon collection, where Philip Tracy designed these really gorgeous bird headdresses, and many of the gowns had wing features on them or bone features on them, and I just adore that collection so much. So when I saw this illustration, my first thought went to, oh my god, I want an amazing bird headdress, just like the ones in the McQueen show. My goal for this project is to marry the typical silhouette of the 1887 fashion period, along with a classic tailored tuxedo look, with the drama of a McQueen gown and the classiness of the Valentino Julia Roberts dress. Now, that's kind of a lot of things to combine, but this is part of why I love the idea of this project so much. I'm probably not going to be using historical fabrics as my budget is limited for this, and I know that me personally will probably only wear this dress a couple of times, so I'll be using some alternatives to different types of fabrics, but I'm going to try to remain true to the silhouette, some of the techniques for construction, and the undergarment. For me, the biggest obstacle with this costume is going to be the proportions and making sure that they work on my body type. As you can see, I'm a very curvy girl. I've got about a 14-inch difference between my waist and my hips when I'm corseted, and I will also be wearing a bustle pad and a petticoat under this, so I will have some booty. But I want to make sure that I'm going to get the proportion of the stripes correct from what they look like in the illustration. As you'll see in the front of the illustration, there's a vest. The striped vest in the front comes down at an angle, and I want to make sure that I get that angle exactly where I want it to be while still maintaining the amount of space that I need for that turn back in the front. So what I will likely be doing is creating a new duct tape form of myself while I'm corseted, and then draping most of this bodice directly on the form. Before I could really start with figuring out where things are going to hit on me with this design, I needed to create new foundational garments. So as you'll see, and as is the topic of this video, this will be about the creation of this new corset that I'm wearing.
I began this project by revisiting one of my more recent corset patterns I made earlier this year and analyzing how the fit could be improved for a more accurate 1880s/90s silhouette. This corset fit me well throughout the torso, but had very little room in the bust and pretty much squashed the girls down flat. With the help of the mentors at Foundations Revealed, I did a few alterations of the patterns and some mock-ups to improve the fit. After 3 mock-ups, I got a much more curvy shape and with much more room in the bust. However, as you will see later in this video, this does come back to haunt me. For fabrics and supplies, I ordered black coutil, 6mm synthetic whalebone, boning casing, and a busk from corsetmakingsupplies.com. Admittedly, this was the first time I ever purchased and worked with coutil, and honestly, this coutil is very stiff and I would not purchase this coutil again. Against my better judgment, I also fused the coutil to some tie silk with Heat and Bond Light, and this made everything even stiffer. I began by stay stitching around all of the edges of my panels. I mostly do this to make pinning my seam lines together more accurately later on. Any stay stitching that ends up showing up on the outside, I make sure to remove after the corset is completed. Once the panels were stay stitched, I began pinning the edges wrong sides together, matching the waistline markings. The seams were pressed open and trimmed to 1/8 of an inch. Once all the panels were sewn together, I pinned in a strip of twill tape to serve as a waist tape. I pinned this right on the waistline and basted it in with large pad stitches. The waist tape would eventually be permanently caught in the stitching for the boning channels. Speaking of boning channels, I first went in and pinned a stripe of boning casing along the outside seams. My seams were very curvy, so it was important to pin the tape onto the corset while the corset was sitting over a curved shape, like my tailor's ham. This helps with making sure the casing doesn't wrinkle. When I go to stitch the casing in, I have to ease the tape slightly when sewing. I repeated the same process for the channels that sit in the middle of each of the panels. Next, I prepped the center front panels for the busk. I cut a length of coutil to match the length of the front panels and cut it in half for each side. I used the busk itself to mark out the space that I have to leave unstitched in the seam using a white colored pencil. I made sure to center my busk so that a hook sits right at the waistline. When stitching on the hook side, I backstitched at the start and end of each marked section. This was then pressed open. The hook side of the busk was then inserted into the openings along the seam and pulled in as smooth and tightly as I could. I then pinned the facing and center front panel together. I switched to my zipper foot and stitched as close as I could to the busk. Oh, I broke a needle. Cool! Next, I repeated the same process for the peg side, but this time I did not have to stop when stitching the facing in. Once the seam was pressed and trimmed, I used an awl to create small holes for the pegs to poke through. Then this side was stitched in the same way the hook side was stitched in. Now it was time to cut and insert the boning into the boning channels. I used 6mm synthetic whalebone and cut them with one of my crappy pairs of scissors. I used the scissors to round out the edge and gently filed them with a sandpaper block. Next, it was time to cut fabric for the binding. I raided my stash and found a piece of suede moleskin, which I'm pretty sure was from Joann's. I liked the satin side of it as it gave a nice subtle sheen. I cut a few strips and pinned them right sides together to the top and bottom edges of the corset. One part of the binding was stitched down by machine. Then I turned the edge to the inside, folded it, pinned it, and felled it down by hand. Unfortunately, I do not have any footage of me actually hand sewing the binding, but it's just felling, and you can find a million videos out there on how to do that. Next up, I started flossing the corset. I spent more time flossing the corset than any other step and only filmed a small bit of it. I ended up doing kind of a sketchy feather design on the bottom edge of the corset and a more traditional cross design on the top. I ended up going back over the feather flossing afterwards to beef up the design and make them more noticeable from far away. I'm still not 100% happy with them as I don't like the thread that I used, and I think something with a little more softness and suppleness would have looked better than the wax buttonhole thread that I used. Once I had the flossing designs in, it was time to add the grommets. These grommets came in a kit I purchased from Etsy a while ago. Here you can see I made sure that I had enough washers to go with each grommet as my stash was running low. My awl is not tapered, so I cannot use it to make a hole big enough. I ended up punching holes with my grommet pliers and ruining my already sad looking nails while pushing the grommets through. Remember how I said I would be haunted by the room I added in my bust? Well, somehow the changes I had made from the third mock-up to this point would be outdated within a month, since when I finally put the corset on, it was huge in the bust. I was very upset and disappointed that I had to rip out my binding, my boning channels, and my flossing in order to make adjustments. Here you can see my attempts at fitting this on myself. I did most of the fitting and pinning in front of my mirror, which is also why my lacing is now off-center. Oy! Anyways, after making some adjustments to the seams, the fit was much better. I went back in and re-sewed the boning channels, binding, and flossing. To top it all off, once I finished that step, I decided I needed 2 more bones in the center front panels, so I again ripped off my binding and stitched in 2 more channels. At this point, I went back in and added more to the feather flossing to pump up the thickness of the shafts and make them look thicker. All in all, I'm happy with the fit, though after wearing it for a little while, I think I need a little more length on the back edge. Here's the corset worn with a bustle pad and petticoat I made for Lady Tremaine, so you can get an idea of what my overall silhouette will look like with this costume. If this is not quite enough for what I want, I might just end up wearing my actual bustle that I made for Anastasia with it slightly loosened so it's not as large, but we'll see when I actually get to draping the skirt. I'm probably going to make a new black and white petticoat and chemise for this project, as I love the idea of matching undergarments to my costumes. Anyways, that's it for this project. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a like and a comment, and if you want to be notified when the next part of this project is completed, please subscribe to this channel and hit that bell option. You can also follow more weekly progress over on my Instagram at ChibiRainoa. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video.